And joining us now on the debate in the American capital, Derek Thompson, staff editor at The Atlantic Magazine. In our nation's capital, Miles Korak, professor of economics at the University of Ottawa. And joining us here in studio, Ron Clavier, author and neuroscientist. Jordan Peterson, professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. And Steve Maish, editor of Canadian Business Magazine. Good to have everybody, both around the table here and in Points Beyond, for a continuation of our discussion about what it is about these 20-somethings. And the thing that really started this discussion, I think, in a large way, was this piece that was in the New York Times Magazine over the summer. So if you joined us late, I'm going to read a short excerpt from this piece, and then we'll come back and talk. It's happening all over, the Times says, in all sorts of families, not just young people moving back home, but also young people taking longer to reach adulthood overall. It's a development that predates the current economic doldrums, and no one yet knows what the impact will be on the prospects of the young men and women, on the parents, on whom so many of them depend, on society, built on the expectation of an orderly progression in which kids finish school, grow up, start careers, make a family, and eventually retire to live on pensions supported by the next crop of kids who finish school, grow up, start careers, make a family, and on and on. The traditional cycle seems to have gone off course as young people remain untethered to romantic partners or to permanent homes, going back to school for lack of better options, traveling, avoiding commitments, competing ferociously for unpaid internships, forestalling the beginning of adult life. Okay, let's go around the horn on this. Oops, I promised somebody. There was a viewer who actually wrote in over the summer, said, don't say that anymore, it really bugs me, so I apologize. Let's go around the table on this. I said I was going to eliminate that from my vocabulary. Derek, come on in here and tell us, why do you think this New York Times piece had such, and you've written a lot about this as well, why do you think it's having such impact?
Well, I think it's having一impact for two reasons. First of all, I think it's quite clear that this is happening, that it's a real phenomenon. That people reading the New York Times are either, a lot of them are kids, and a lot of them are parents of kids, and they see this phenomenon in their children and their children's friends. I do agree with Arnett, I think, even more than the article, that I don't think it's prudent to attribute this to developmental psychology. I think if the question is, what is it with 20-somethings, then you have to conclude that it is the economy. I think we're taking on more education, and we're taking on more education for an economy that right now has less employment. There's a metaphor that we sort of have around the office where the journey from education to full employment is a bit like an escalator, a very expensive escalator, because the average debt for a public school graduate of college is $17,000. But the idea is you get on at the bottom of the escalator in high school, and you ride up the escalator through college and through a graduate degree, and then you get off at the top into the labor market. And right now, the top of the escalator is really congested. There's not a lot of opportunity. And that's one reason why unemployment in our generation among 20-somethings is 15% higher than the rest of the country. So Miles, it's a serious problem, but I think it's a serious economic problem.
Miles, why don't you come in and tell me why you think pieces like Derek Thompson's and this one in the New York Times over the summer have had such an impact?
Well, I was a bit surprised by the Times piece myself, because I didn't find anything terribly new there. I do agree with Arnett and Derek that the fundamental causes here, as opposed to the symptoms, which I think is what Arnett is describing, lie in the economy. And this dates back to the 1970s and a productivity slowdown we've been facing since that time. And the labor market needs to adjust, and it adjusts at its most flexible points. And that's the new people entering the labor market who take the big hit. And you're seeing their behavior respond to that, as opposed to being a cause of it.
Jordan, I was going to come to Steve, actually. Stand by, Jordan. I want to go to Steve for a second here, because I want to follow up on the economic angle there. There seems to be a lot of blame on the economy for this.
Yeah.
Although Arnett says it's certainly well beyond the economy. Now, you follow the economy for a living. What do you say?
I think it's wrong to attribute all of this to the economy. Of course, the economy feeds into every big trend that you see, but the economy follows long wave cycles. And we're actually seeing this as a trend that has been emerging, not over the course of very recent economic turmoil. You're seeing this long-term trend dating back to the 90s and even before that. So I think attributing it to these short-run things that are happening in the economy is entirely wrong. Where we're actually seeing a sociological change. And I would argue that this is the outgrowth of a change that we saw in parenting and in media approaches 30 years ago. in the way that we spoke to kids about what they could expect from their lives, and the way that we spoke to them about things like self-esteem and self-centeredness. And I think that that is the outgrowth that we're seeing now, far more so than the economy.
He's the economics guy, you're the psychology guy. Are you going to approach this from a different vantage point here?
Well, it's funny because when my temperament is to blame the kids who are staying at home, but there's this idea in psychology called the fundamental attribution error. And the fundamental attribution error is what you do when you curse when someone cuts you off in traffic. You assume that there's something wrong with them instead of taking the situation into account. And the more investigation I did into this phenomena for this show, the more I was convinced that, yeah, it's really economic reasons that are doing this. So shall I show this graph?
Sure, why not?
All right, so I found this graph, for example.
Over here, Tom.
And what it shows is the relationship between the average housing price from 1970 to 2000.
One on the bottom. Yeah, zoom in on the one on the bottom, Tom. Yeah, that one there.
Yeah.
Look at this graph. Everybody does sum a lot of it up.
All right, so basically what you see is from 1970 to 2005, the average house price went from 240% of the median home income, that's the typical home income, to 480%. And also at the same time, in 1970, most households were headed by single family or single person earners, and now they're headed by two family earners. So basically that means that housing prices are now 4 times as expensive as they were in the 1970s.
Which goes a long way to explaining emerging adulthood.
Yeah, well, it's a big problem, so.
Yes?
Except for one important thing that graph does not capture. 2 huge changes in the economic. That refers to base housing price. It doesn't refer to the cost of owning a home. The massive drop in interest rates and the government intervention to make mortgage payments tax deductible in the United States massively reduced the cost of carrying house prices like that. So while I don't dispute the fact that housing prices have gone up, the cost of owning a home hasn't gone up anywhere near as much. So while economics and housing prices may contribute to the fact that people are opting to stay home, they are by no means the driving force.
Okay, in which case, we're hearing a lot about economics being the key driver behind all this, which is why we need a neuroscientist here to tell us about what's going on in the head. Ron, that's for you. We've done a number of programs on this, as I was saying to Professor Arnett, and we have learned over the years that the brain is constantly changing, certainly through the teenage years. How about into the 20s? Even into your 20s, is the brain changing? That might explain part of this phenomenon?
The brain continues to change, but I must say that there is no fundamental, either morphological, that is in terms of the look of the brain, or the function of the brain. There's no fundamental paradigm shift in cognition that occurs between the teenage years and the adult years, and I think everybody has agreed with that on this show so far. There is a fundamental paradigm shift between the child's brain and the adult's brain, the child's mind and the adult's mind. The emerging adolescent is faced with huge changes and a complete dropping out of the bottom of his life because everything is now different. And they feel insecure and they think they're the first ones this ever happened to because we never explained to them that it's normal. But by the time you get to be 18 or 19 or 20, you're pretty comfortable with that. Now, the brain does continue to change, but it's an ongoing change that started a long time ago. The fact is, our bodies get older. Your 30-year-old face looks different than your 20-year-old face. Your 30-year-old brain looks different from your 20-year-old brain, but it doesn't mean it's working that fundamentally differently.
Let me ask the question, Derek, of you that all of the grandparents watching this program right now are probably asking themselves. Number one, how old are you, Derek?
I'm 24.
24. Are you less mentally mature than their generation was?
I guess there's no way for me to know that. And even if I said something, then it might be accused of being mentally mature. So that seems like a trick question. What I would say, though, is just a couple things more on the economy. I also want to mention that I think there's another E that's a big factor here, which is education. One quick stat is that in 1970, women comprised 36% of college graduates, and now they comprise more than half. Mm-hmm. When women go to school longer, that puts off marriage for an entire generation, and that's a good thing, but it's also a thing that delays what we consider adulthood. The thing I wanted to bring out in terms of the economy is, it's interesting, I can't see the graph right now of median wages to median home prices, but something's happened with median wages over the last 30 years. They've stagnated. And we're not entirely clear what exactly is the thing that's caused it to stagnate. It might be technology soaking up jobs. It might be globalization moving jobs to other places. But one thing that's sort of lurking behind this is healthcare inflation. And even as education costs have increased exponentially over the last 30 years, rising even faster is the cost of healthcare. Right now, you're seeing a situation in which compensation is rising for a lot of people, but average wages aren't. And that's because healthcare premiums are increasing so much that they're eating into our wages.
I should ask the
That's
guy,
another thing
you're in the
keeping
system,
us at
Ron.
home, I think.
What do you think?
I'm sorry.
Healthcare inflation is a part of an explanation behind all this?
Absolutely. Life is more expensive, and you can't blame kids for young people for wanting to have a decent life. Remember, the media also, that was a very good point, and our parents give us a sense of expectation, of entitlement to the better life. And that's costly. It was interesting that Arnett said, when you asked him in the interview in Fourth, he said, this is occurring all over the world. And then I thought, all over the world, that's a big place. And then he went on to say, well, in all industrialized nations. And I think there are more people living in the non-industrialized world than there are in the industrialized world.
That's a fair point.
It's not happening where it isn't being allowed to happen.
Which really argues for the idea, as you were saying before, that this is a sociological change.
Precisely.
And the economy may play a role in that for sure, but
Jordan?
Yeah, well, there's other factors too. I don't want to only concentrate on economic factors. I was listening to a Beach Boys song from like 1959 the other day, and they were singing about their desire to move out of home so they could cohabit with their girlfriend, marry her actually, you know. And so that's gone. And since the 70s, we've been focusing more and more on a child-centered approach to child rearing. But there's a problem with that, and the problem is you're only a child for 18 years. And then you're an adult for like 70 years. And so you gotta wonder why a child who has had everything centered around them would feel that adulthood is worth attaining, given that almost all the privileges that were restricted to adults 50 years ago are now amply available to people who are in their teens. So, and the wage stagnation thing is interesting too, and this is a completely unexamined phenomenon as far as I've been able to determine, is that wages have flattened in part because people have moved to two-income families. And so there's real downward pressure on male wages as a consequence of females entering the workforce. And so that also means that there's much less privilege involved for males in adopting the responsibility of a family, which is a heavy responsibility, especially if you don't have money and if you have a relatively wide range of sexual access.
Miles, I think I heard you try to get in.
Yeah, I tried to get in a couple of times. I think the healthcare explanation is probably has more resonance in the U.S. than in Canada. And also the economy issue, we have to think of it as a long-term trend, not as a cyclical up and down like the recession we're going through now. The root cause of this is slower productivity growth that came out of the 1970s. And you see the rapid deterioration of the labor market experiences of the young happening at a very distinct point in time, and that was in the early 1980s. Since that time, it's just been very flat wage growth. And all of the gains in our society have been just captured by a very small fraction of the group. And this has led to the kinds of situations that people have described. Flat wages, inability to afford housing, the need for more education. But there are other two big shocks that have been going on. And again, these are long-term trends. One, since the 1990s, we've become a much more globalized economy, so that the lower skill part of our labor market is competing in a much more dramatic way with the low-skilled workers throughout the rest of the world. It means that if you don't have an education, you're not going to see your wages increase over your life cycle. And people adapt to that, and they use what supports they can. And part of those supports are mom and dad's basement sometimes. But eventually, they have enough experience, work experience, and enough education to move on out of that phase.
Well, as I suggested, there was a big response to the Times piece over the summer, and one of the first shots out of the gate on that was from the Huffington Post just a few days later. Michael, let's put this quote up. Are there millennials who are unaccomplished? Yes. Are there millennials who are moving back home and living with their parents after getting degrees from the best colleges in the world? Of course. This is not the downfall of a generation, nor is it for lack of motivation and effort. Some of these new issues and lifestyle questions are directly related to the triple threat of economic issues, a lack of good quality jobs, a lack of affordable housing, and the high burdens of college loans and family debt. And yes, some of us are troubled by a lack of clarity and a need to experiment with how to best mesh the values we were raised with. Find your passion. Do something important with your life. Find love and happiness with the difficult realities of our world. But the success stories of millennials far outweigh the challenges. This is a generation of pragmatic idealists who are changing and will change the world. Steve, I guess the question is, if you've been told by your parents for a decade, find your passion, follow your dreams.
Absolutely.
Should we be surprised that it's taken them longer to get in on those tracks?
We should not be surprised in the least. We should be deeply concerned, however. And all this idea that this is a wonderful, passionate generation who will change the world, you could have said that about absolutely every generation coming out of university going back 50 years. It is an easy thing to say, and it may end up being true. That doesn't change the fact that we are paying a certain price here. For a lot of these messages that we've been inculcating kids with from the time they turn 2 years old, which is that the most important thing that we see as our role as parents is to instill a sense of self-esteem. And self-esteem is a wonderful thing, but not when it is taken in isolation to all the other important values that help people mesh into society. Things like empathy, sacrifice, hard work, occasionally failure. These are all things that have largely gone out of fashion in parenting, and we are paying a price for them. I would argue what it's done is it's created a generation that is phenomenally good at consuming and not very good at all at producing. And if you look at the macroeconomic trends that the Western world is grappling with now, those are the big problems that we need to overcome. We need to get a lot better at producing and meshing into that competitive global economy, and a lot less concerned with consumption.
Let's get a follow-up here from Ron and then Jordan.
But this comes right back to a definition of success. And for so long, when you think about work, I go back to what the physicists said about work. Physicists, we study physics back in high school and we remember all our formulas, and then we forget what it all means. Work is force times mass times distance. All right, so what does that mean? Well, we've got force. We're all saying our kids have energy. They've got the force. But what are they pushing that force against? What do they need to move across some distance? In other words, what's wrong with the world that they would make better as a result of their work, as a result of their effort? The kids know the answer to that. If you ask them a question, what are you passionate about? What would you change? How would you make the world better? They have a good answer for that. But we're not teaching them how to do that. We're not giving them tools to do that, to say that it's possible to do. And we're not giving them other reasons for doing the work. If you say, all right, you'll do the work, this is what we get, well, what's in it for us? If we're only going to tell them that success is because it is measured in terms of the money you get for that work, you're going to have trouble. There's other things that come as a result of as payoffs for work. One is accomplishment. Another is contribution to society. Another is passion. And probably the most important is that money comes with a cost, and that cost is time with your family and with your friends and with your hobbies and with your interests and contributing to your community. We should at school be giving those payoffs for work, so it won't be as important for the kids to have those high paying jobs.
I appreciate that, but Jordan, I suspect there are people at home who are saying right now, yes, that's all well and good, but you expect to do it on our nickel. You want to pursue your dreams, you want to go wherever you want to go, you want to take that 5th trip to Europe. As long as we subsidize it.
Yeah, but it's a funny thing because the parental generation has also benefited from a kind of intergenerational Ponzi scheme that's been going on for about 30 years too. So one is the massive increase in housing prices that we already talked about. The other is the increasing reluctance of taxpayers and tax systems to properly fund higher education at precisely the same time that far more people are being pushed into higher education because of its economic necessity. So Richard Vedders, who wrote Going Broke by Degrees, points out that the cost of tuition in the US has tripled compared to the consumer price index over the last 15 years. And so the parents aren't paying for tuition for universities to the same degree that my parents are, and part of the price they're paying for that is that their kids have to live at home because they don't have enough money to go off to school. And then they graduate to low-paying jobs generally with a lot of debt. So that's an economic problem as well.
Derek, come on in.
Right, it's interesting. The argument about us being takers rather than makers. Something about being a taker rather than a maker, it seems sort of almost more quintessentially American than it does millennial. There was recently the cover story for The Atlantic for the last month was about the boomer generation and how the boomer generation comes from the greatest generation and it grows up to the 60s and the 70s in sort of marinating in idealism, and then ultimately it leaves us now with a recession and with the largest projected 20-year debt burden that we've ever had in this country's history, precisely because they've expected to take Social Security and increasing Medicare and Medicaid healthcare options and to pay less in taxes over every single decade in terms of effective tax rates. So the idea of taking versus making, I think, has sort of become quintessentially American in a way that I don't think is specific to one generation over another. To the extent that we're promised more than is available in the world, I don't know. I certainly hear the claim that parents in this generation do coddle their kids more, and that we do come out of college and high school a bit softer. I wasn't alive in previous generations, so I don't know what the difference has been. But I do think that if you look at volunteerism, it's rather high for our generation. If you look at programs like Teach for America, I think there is, in a lot of ways, a spirit of giving among 20-somethings that's just the same as there's been in previous generations, like with the Peace Corps and the AmeriCorps.
Well, let me try this. Here's a bit of
a generational.
Sorry, I'm just going to say this is a bit of an odd question for a professor of economics, but I'm going to go to you with this one anyway, Miles. How much do you think all of what we're talking about today, and if there is a bit of a stigma attached to this, as there might be with the previous generations, how much of that would you attribute to the fact that they're just jealous because this group got to postpone adulthood and the previous groups did not?
Well, I suppose the New York Times piece could have also been titled, "What's the Problem with 60-somethings?" This, in a sense, has been a very privileged generation. As has been pointed out, it rode a wave of rising house prices and rising productivity. And now it's time to share that wealth. And so we're seeing this, I wouldn't call it an intergenerational conflict, but a certain intergenerational inequity developing. What's really important, I think, in all of this, and a lot of this sounds a little bit too upper middle class for my ears, because I see and hear about a lot of young people working 2 jobs to be able to afford their apartments, a lot of people coming from disadvantaged family backgrounds that don't have the kind of social supports that are needed. What's really important here is to appreciate that, in fact, these people are makers, that they're struggling very hard, but the situation they're facing is very different, and that's at the root cause of this.
And I wonder, Ron, if that's because, I mean, the economy being the huge story around all this, in your experience, does this emerging adulthood generation, do they, I don't want to say they fear adulthood, but is there a certain trepidation with adulthood? Oh my goodness, I've graduated, I've gone back and got my 2nd degree, and look at what I'm graduating into. You know, the teeth of the worst recession since the Great Depression, the near collapse of the financial system, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you might want to postpone adulthood if that's what you're graduating into.
It comes into 2 things that relate to motivation. One is a fear of failure. If I try, I won't be able to succeed, and I may not be able to succeed in the way my parents succeeded. There's also a fear of success, which you see among young adults of this age.
A fear of success?
Yes, absolutely.
So?
A fear of success. I think everybody can see it. You see in the later years of high school and in the early years of university, young people, for no apparent reason, dropping out. They're becoming disenchanted. They're taking the gap year, but only to get away. They're not doing it with any purpose in mind. And one of the reasons is, and they'll say it, is that they do not want to, if they continue to work hard, they feel as though they're on a railway going to a destination that they do not want to be. They see corruption, they see malfeasance, they see irresponsibility, they see a generation that they don't admire very much, doing things that they don't admire very much, and they don't want to be part of it, and they're jumping off the train.
Jordan, you want to follow up on that? Is this generation partly to blame?
I actually do. Yes, for sure. I think that any time a baby boomer calls another member of another generation lazy and overprivileged, they should really be careful. Yeah. So, but I don't buy the this generation doesn't admire their parents' argument, because I don't think that statistically that's true. I saw a survey a while back showing that a majority of teenagers in the United States listed their parents among people they admire most. And I think, much as I really even hate to admit this, that part of the reason that teenagers or young adults aren't moving out is because there's nowhere near as much intergenerational friction as there was, say, in 1971, when a substantial proportion of, at least the Americans, young people were being shipped off into a war they didn't really want to go to.
Sure.
So part of the reason that people are staying at home is because they actually get along with their parents. And now, as a clinician, I see some of the downside of that. Like I see people who are overly dependent and too enmeshed in their family to reach independence, but that's a biased sample. And the students I teach at the University of Toronto, they're hardworking and motivated to a much greater degree than my generation was, and they are also boosted by the terror of what they're going to encounter when they graduate. So,
let me get Miles and Steve Maish on this next question, which is, we all know that in order for the mathematics of society to work, the next generation has got to be successful in order that it be able to pay for the pensions and benefits of the generation that is about to retire. And I wonder, Miles, to you first and then Steve, I wonder how much of the older generation's concern about the younger generation is that social contract, if you like, for a lack of a better expression, is breaking down right now. And we're not sure that the next generation behind us is going to be able to support the lifestyle to which the older generations become accustomed.
Well, that's certainly an interesting point. The way the pension system has worked up to now, the first wave of pensioners into the Canadian program got this huge windfall gain, and I'm not sure it's going to be there for the next generation. My concern actually, and it hasn't been mentioned yet, Steve, is the gender difference between the young. The situation for boys is very different than girls. And whatever happens in the economy is going to be related to the rate of growth of productivity. And it seems that girls are better positioned to capture that than boys. So the real emerging problem that we have is going to be a gender breakdown in the next 10 or 20 years.
That would speak to what many are calling the he-cession as opposed to recession. But okay, Steve, follow up if you would on that whole issue of the social contract.
Well, I think that is part of it. And to be honest with you, I think we're right to worry about that. I think one of the great dividends of our industrial expansion over the past 100 years is the fact that we were able to create a social safety net, and we were able to say to people, if you put in an entire lifetime of work, you are going to be able to look forward to pension. You're going to be able to look forward to drugs that you can afford, healthcare, that sort of thing. It is an important part of the dividend of this great prosperity that we've got. But a big part of that contract that you were talking about is the idea that people emerge from school and are willing to enter the workforce and take low-paid, hard-working, often thankless tasks to pay their dues and come along. There is a great value to that, a social value and also an economic value, as people learn the lessons from the generation that comes before that. As it breaks down, we're absolutely right to worry about that. We are absolutely right to worry that the next generation that's coming in is ill-prepared for that, because who knows what comes after it. I mean, Derek was mentioning before that it's strange to attribute all this to the millennials. He's right about that. We are all products of the generation that went before us. The millennials are absolutely a product of the baby boomer parents. And what's worrying is that these trends that we're talking about, rises in narcissism, impatience with work and paying your dues and raising expectations in terms of what you can expect from a career, is getting steadily worse and going inexorably in this direction each generation that goes by. And it's not simply a result of the economy.
Equal time for Derek on that one. Go ahead, Derek.
Right, you know, it's interesting. Not to brag here, but we are the richest country in the world. And we're the most highly educated generation in the history of the richest country in the world. I see no reason to particularly fear for our ability to work and be productive in places where former generations have been productive, and then to discover, you know, the next great engine of the American economy, the same way that advances on the internet, you know, sort of transformed the 1990s. I don't think we have to be scared about our generation's ability to accomplish those things. I think what we have to be scared about is the promises that we have made to seniors that we now know we can't fully keep. And the problem for that isn't the fact that our generation isn't productive. The problem is that healthcare inflation is simply out of control, and that we understand how to keep people alive for a lot longer than we have the capacity to pay for them to be alive.
And frankly,
so
their
I think
generation
that if the
shouldn't
government
have
can
to,
change the way.
Your generation shouldn't have to carry the can on that one, because it was the boomers who were promising the boomers and their elders all of the things that they can no longer afford. So we should point that out. Jordan, why don't you just follow up on the I saw
Well,
you
I think,
on the
well,
gender issue that I
yeah,
think you
well,
were
the
interested
gender
in.
issue is an interesting one, because one of the things I think I've detected in the universities over the last 20 years is increasing uncertainty in identity among the young men. And that's not surprising to me, because male unemployment rates are either at or near post-war records. It's not the case for females. And the privileges of being male. See, the thing about being male is you have to voluntarily accept responsibility for a family. If you're a female, you don't have to do that, because as soon as you have a baby, you're basically forced into the position where you're going to take responsibility. But a male has to do that voluntarily. And the rewards for that, fundamentally, at least to me, for the new generation, seems to have vanished. There's very little privilege, there's very little payment, there's very little stability. And so I see a lot of young men wondering, what am I supposed to do, and why is it that I would do what I'm supposed to do in the future? What's the gain? And I don't really see what the gain is for many of them.
Steve, you want to follow?
Huge chunks of the world don't view the idea of raising a family in those transactional terms, and that is a great advantage for them, I would argue. And I admire Derek's optimism for his generation, and on my better days I can share it. But I can tell you, when I look around and say who is going to create the breakthroughs that are going to really drive the better standards of living in the next generation ahead, I got to tell you, I'm not necessarily betting on the United States, and that's in large part because of these social attitudes that have been baked in.
Jordan?
Yeah, I don't believe that there are large portions of the world that don't view family responsibilities as transactional. I just think the economics are different. I mean, in many pre-industrial countries, it's to your economic advantage, clearly, to have as many children as possible. Whereas in our society, children are unbelievably expensive to a later and later date, as we're discussing in this program.
Well, let me follow up on that aspect of it, because, let's go to you first on this, Ron. Do we need to rethink how we do, for example, some aspects of social policy in this country and the United States, given this notion of emerging adulthood becoming a real thing that I think you all around the table agree is a real thing? For example, I don't know, maybe drug policy. I think that most people's drug plans, if you're an employee in this country, cover your kids up to a certain age. Maybe we've got to cover them up until age 30 now, because adulthood is they're going to be dependent on their parents for that much longer. You want to change policy that way?
First of all, I'm not a policy maker, so I don't feel comfortable talking about that. But in relation to drugs, remember there's two different kinds of drug use in our society. And although we may live in a highly productive, industrialized country, and I'll include Canada with the United States in that, we may have the highest per capita income and we may have the highest per capita benefits, but we're also the highest per capita user of drugs, both prescription and illicit drugs in the world, and also the highest user of psychiatrists. So we can't be all that happy about our affluence and our wealth. I think that it probably would be a mistake to further infantilize people in their 20s by offering them benefits that they, in my opinion, really, frankly, ought to be going out and working for.
Miles, let me get you on that as well.
I tend to agree with that, Steve. I think the important thing for policymakers to do, and I don't mean to be flippant here, but to do nothing in sort of a reasonable and intelligent way. The kind of proposal that you put on the table for drug policy could sort of change sort of incentives and lead to extended periods of adulthood. I think we have to, in the first instance, accept that we've got a labor market that is generating a lot more inequality. And so the way policy might be directed is to make work pay, to increase wages in some way. For example, a couple of years ago, the Minister of Finance in his February budget introduced something called the Working Income Tax Benefit. And this was basically an American idea. The Americans have the Employed Earnings Income Tax Benefit, where wages are topped up according to how hard you work in the workplace or how many hours you spend. So keeping the incentive structure structured towards engagement in the labor market, I think, is important, and social policy would be regressing if it responded in a way that would increase the incentives to stay at home.
I'm going to give the last 30 seconds. Forgive me, I'm going to jump in, Miles, because we've got about 30 seconds left, and I want to give it to Derek. But first, I want to explain why it's called. You know why they called it that. You know why it's called that, right? Because the acronym WHITBY. That's where the Minister of Finance is from. Anyway, that's why he called it that. Derek, why don't you take the last 30 seconds of the program and give some advice to the generation above that may occasionally look down its noses and glasses at your generation with concern. What do you want to say?
I guess what I want to say is that I don't think we need as much help as the other generations think. I think that a nation and an economy with 16 of the best 20 universities in the world is naturally going to be the leader when it comes to innovation, when it comes to finding the best new products and services for helping the world. I do think that our generation is going to be all right, that the kids are going to be all right, and I think we'll be all right when the economy is all right. I see absolutely no reason to think that there's any reason to worry about this generation more than any other generation. In fact, I think you should be more optimistic if you think that education means anything.
That seems like a great place to leave it. Can I thank all of our guests for participating in today's discussion, starting out of town in Washington, D.C., with Derek Thompson, the staff editor at theatlantic.com, and Miles Corrick, Professor of Economics in the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. My thanks to you two. Back here in the studio, Jordan Peterson, the clinical psychologist at the University of Toronto, Steve Maish, editor, Canadian Business Magazine, and Ron Clavier, the neuroscientist. Thanks so much, everybody. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.